Welcome everyone. Thank you all for attending today. Our presentation is going to walk through the updates to the benthic or toxic algal mats guidance. If you're familiar with the previous version, we're rolling out some new updates to that guidance. And included also in today's presentation is going to be a pretty detailed high-level walkthrough of the field SOP. So that's something else that we'll talk about in terms of getting ready for monitoring benthic HABs this season. So I will be leading this presentation along with Elena, and I'll jump into those introductions now. So let's go to the next slide here. Yeah, my name is Hannah Murgis. I am a current California State Sea Grant Fellow that was placed with the State Water Resources Control Board in the Office of Information Management and Analysis. And I'm working within the swamp unit, and one of my projects is with the FHAB program on this new guidance rollout. So I'm leading this again with Elena, who will introduce herself in a moment. I just wanted to point out that the FHAB program is spearheaded and led by Carly Nelson and Marissa Van Dyke, who will be on the call today and will be around to answer any questions during our live Q&A. So I'll let Elena go ahead and introduce herself.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Elena Sulia, and I'm an environmental scientist in the Office of Information Management and Analysis with Hannah.
Awesome. Okay, so before we get into the meat of the presentation today, we just wanted to blast a quick Zoom poll for all of you, which will pop up on your screen shortly. It's just 4 basic questions to kind of gather some preliminary information about who's joining us today. So you'll see these 4 questions on the screen here and then also in the Zoom poll, but a short answer of which regions or region you're working within, and then any kind of knowledge that you have about benthic or toxic algal mats coming into this presentation, how you feel comfort level wise with the material from the SOP before taking the training today, and then also what your level of experience is, if any, with monitoring benthic, specifically benthic or toxic algal mats. So we'll put up the Zoom poll now and we'll leave it open for a minute or two to let people answer, and anyone who's kind of joining late can hopefully get a chance to answer, and then we'll walk through the results briefly. Okay, it looks like we're at about 70% participation, so we'll leave it open for another minute or so if we can have about 20 or so more people answer it. If you're just hopping on, the questions are on the screen and the poll should be up on your screen as well. Okay, it looks like we're almost at 80%, so maybe just another 30 seconds or minute to see if we can get a few more responses. Okay. Looks like we're Not getting any more coming in, and we're about 85% responses. So I'll go ahead and end the poll. Actually, let's go through the results first. If I drag these onto my screen, can you see the results here like this? Is that? No. So that's a no from Elena. Okay, let me see. How did I do this last time? Oh,
I think it should be sharing.
oh, now you should be sharing. Okay, cool. Maybe I did have to end it. Okay, cool. So just to run through the results, we'll look at the short answer question, which is the first question, after the end of this meeting to kind of gather some information about where people are tuning in from. But in terms of people's existing knowledge or comfort with the material, it looks like about 76% of people have at least some knowledge of benthic or toxic algal mats. 20% have no knowledge, and 2 of you that responded, so 4% have advanced knowledge, which is great. And then in terms of how comfortable folks are feeling with the material, namely the SOP before taking the training, looks like the largest percentage is feeling neutral. So 39% of people feel kind of neutral about comfort level. 22% for kind of split between somewhat uncomfortable and somewhat comfortable. So 22% for both on either side of that neutral. And then nobody's feeling super comfortable, but we do have about 17% of people feeling very uncomfortable. So hopefully after today, we can kind of shift some of those uncomfort levels to at least a neutral, hopefully somewhat comfortable. And then in terms of people's experience with monitoring, 57% of people reported being novice, so having done some monitoring, but definitely still learning. 33% of people have no experience, so never monitored before for benthic or toxic algal mats. And then 11% of people reported being advanced beginner, so monitoring somewhat regularly and for a couple of years. But no one is yet an expert. So now we can go ahead and stop sharing those results. Oops. Okay. Cool. So now, if you did not see the participant agenda that was maybe sent around, this is just a brief outline for today's talk to kind of orient you to where we're going to be going. So we'll start with just a brief introduction to what exactly benthic HABs are. Then we'll go into the history of the previous guidance, as well as some of the recent updates. And then I'll turn it over to Elena, who will walk us through a review of the field SOP. And then I'll conclude with kind of using all the information that we talked about to interpret the field data and talk about new information that may inform signage postings. And then we will end with some resources that we can go through so you know where to find things after this presentation is over. And then we'll open up for a live Q&A. So to get into what benthic HABs are, if you are one of the people who reported being somewhat familiar with them, you might see this first picture and think that that's not a benthic HABs, which you'd be correct. This is a planktonic bloom. But this is what most people think of when they hear the words harmful algal blooms. Unlike these planktonic blooms, benthic HABs can grow as mats, so they can be attached to the benthos or the bottom substrate on rocks or cobble or sand. These are 2 examples that you can see here, and they can grow even when a river looks clear or pristine. And so unlike that kind of green pea soup planktonic bloom that you saw in that first picture, the benthic HABs can grow, again, like I said, when the rivers are clear, pristine, and this can create some messaging challenges because a lot of people are associating these HABs with more of the planktonic blooms. Another thing to note about benthic HABs is that they can easily detach. whether in highly recreated areas or when they get older. And then once they detach, they can float to the surface and get trapped downstream or along shorelines, like you can see here in this photo. Um, and this is a concern because the primary exposure of to these benthic HABs has been ingestion of the mat material. And so the bulk of the cyanotoxin load is actually contained within that mat material, which is why incidental ingestion can be potentially really dangerous compared to planktonic blooms, where the cyanotoxin load is in the surrounding water. And I just wanted to pause for a minute before we continue. If you notice in the title slide, there's benthic HABs versus HCBs, so harmful algal blooms or harmful cyanobacterial blooms. HABs can refer to other organisms outside of cyanobacteria, so something like golden algae, for example. But since a lot of the language in the guidance is referring to benthic HCBs, which focuses primarily on the cyanobacterial blooms and is more specific, we'll be trying to stick with that language in the presentation as well.
Here is a video showing non-toxic filamentous algae, which has the texture similar to that of pulling hair, as you can see here.
There are three main types of benthic cyanobacteria that you can see pictured here. So there are a total of about 30 different toxin and non-toxin producing cyanobacteria genera. And of those 30, about 6 genera are capable of developing extensive single species dominant mats. And of those 6, the 3 that you see pictured on the slide here were shown or found to produce cyanotoxins in greater concentrations and are capable of detachment, leading to that incidental ingestion. So we're focusing on these 3 primarily, and the cyanotoxin of primary concern is anatoxins. And so the presence of these 3 genera can provide the basis for kind of some percent cover estimates, which I'll elaborate on when we talk more about the guidance.
These are pictures and videos showing the texture of microcoleus out in the field. And this video is showing an example of microcoleus detached mats floating in the water. The texture resembles that of raw chicken skin, and it breaks apart in your fingers.
So now moving into that guidance, I just want to highlight before we get into it that the North Coast region has been pioneering the monitoring efforts for these benthic mats. And so a lot of the California data that we have is coming from their studies. So originally, the guidance was drafted and created to address the several challenges that are present when monitoring HCBs. These challenges can include the presence of multiple cyanobacterial genera within a single mat, as well as the variability in toxin production, and also the types of toxins that can be produced by the different genera. So toxin production is not necessarily homogeneous among these closely associated mats, and there can be high spatial variation between the mats in discrete areas of streams or dispersing along longer reaches. And so throughout this process of drafting the guidance, there was an extensive literature review to inform some of the new guidance recommendations. One of the other goals of the guidance in its original establishment was to standardize the procedures across the state to more accurately assess potential risks. So in 2017, the CCHAB network, so the California Cyanobacterial Harmful Algal Bloom Network, has a benthic subcommittee that met and wrote the original SOP for water sample collection and toxin analysis. And this kind of provided the first standardized guidance and procedures to assess those potential risks from the benthic HCBs. And what risks and that might pose to the health of humans and domestic animals. And then following the standardization of these procedures, the goal again was to implement that statewide to ensure consistency in data collection. And this would help, again, accurately inform the public health communications. So previously, the guidance included signage guidance for recreational health protection. And this is important because there wasn't too much science at the time to back up the triggers of when to post and depost. So signage was originally recommended with any detection of cyanotoxin or toxinogenic benthic algae. And so that's something that we'll focus on when we get towards the new updates to the signage recommendations, because now there are a bit more thresholds for when to post and depost. But there also included a switch from toxic algae to benthic algae or cyanobacteria in the language of the guidance documents, but you will still see the words toxic algae on the signs. But what the previous guidance did not include was customization to different use types. So the Benthic subcommittee reconvened in 2023 to discuss some of these updates to improve the existing guidance. And one of those main goals was to incorporate new use types. So for example, event response or follow-up monitoring compared to routine monitoring. They also wanted to update the guidance to include signage recommendations based on those different monitoring types, and then have analysis approaches for algal and cyanobacterial mats, which we'll hear more about during the SOP section on how to do that. And then also to include additional indicators or thresholds for signage posting triggers. And lastly, to update the scientific basis and existing literature to inform these monitoring protocols. So as the science continues to be updated, so will the guidance. So this is kind of a iterative process and an ever-growing process. And much more is available now than when the original guidance was drafted. So to walk through a timeline, I've kind of mentioned it with some of the words on my slides, but just to have a visual. So again, in 2017, that original SOP was written and published. And the goal of this subcommittee was to kind of reassess some of the indicators for issuing these toxic algae alerts. So they evaluated new and emerging monitoring techniques and various resource scenarios to develop recommendations for posting signs. And then in 2020, the CCHAB Network developed a voluntary guidance to address the benthic HCB response, and this included those signage posting trigger levels. And then from May in 2023 to late last year in November, there were regular meetings with the benthic subcommittee members to review those documents, again, incorporating some of the new updated science. And then at the end of last year in December, they sent out the updated guidance for a solicited review of the draft of these new products. And then earlier this year in January, they presented comments and updates at the CCHAB Network meeting. And that brings us to here at the end of May. From March until now, there has been kind of the approval process and now the rollout of these updates, which include the specific monitoring guidance to the use types, as well as signage postings, and the implementation of a tiered monitoring approach using SPATS, and SPATS stands for Solid Phase Adsorption Toxin Tracking, which I will get into in a few slides. So now moving into some of the main updates for the revised guidance. Again, the benthic subcommittee wanted it to be a bit more comprehensive, and so they developed these interim numeric thresholds using the SPAT passive samplers and benthic cyanobacterial percent cover based on the results from, again, as I mentioned earlier, the special studies that were conducted in the Northern Coast regional boards, as well as with the state water boards. To kind of address this overall question of should human use or domestic animal use, such as dogs and other pets, be restricted in a water body due to the presence of harmful cyanobacterial blooms. So the goals of this new updated guidance are still to provide this standardized procedure in order to assess the risks that HCBs pose. But the new protocol sets things like stream reaches, percent coverage, and detailed instructions for composite mat samples. Again, those will be touched on a bit more in the SOP section. But the goal was to implement this, again, statewide by the Water Board's FHAB program to ensure consistent approaches are applied throughout California so that we can produce data of known quality. And of course, to inform accurately public health communications related to potential exposure. Now we also have information about event response guidance plus follow-up and routine monitoring protocol. So that was something, again, that wasn't included in the previous versions. But in the SOP, these monitoring types will be a bit further explained and include some visual and qualitative approaches. And then they also updated just the existing literature. So they pulled from the updated existing literature rather to update some of the thresholds and triggers for signage postings. And then they prioritized percent cover data. So this is something that I'll focus on for the remainder of this kind of new guidance section, but percent cover data is really rapid and low cost, and it relates well to potential exposure to these benthic HCBs. So anything above that 15% cover threshold is going to trigger a signage posting, and I'll emphasize that throughout. The thing to note here is that percent cover data still does not tell you about possible toxin concentration, so that is important to note. But again, it gets you your results pretty quickly, meaning you can get that exactly when you're in the field rather than having to wait for lab results for the toxin data. So how we monitor the event response, how we monitor the benthic harmful cyanobacterial blooms is through these three ways that you see on the screen. So the first two are kind of related to each other, where you have event response and then follow-up monitoring, and then you have this third type of monitoring called routine monitoring. So we're going to be primarily focusing on these first two, the event response and the follow-up monitoring. So event response kind of refers to the sampling that occurs after the receipt of a bloom report or observation to assess recreational exposure risk to humans and domestic animals. So that essentially means that no monitoring was conducted prior to the HCB report. Follow-up monitoring is the sampling that occurs post-event response and informs longer-term health risks and deposting actions. And then routine monitoring is ongoing or predetermined sampling that precedes event response to survey for bloom formation or monitoring efforts as part of a routine monitoring program to assess water quality. So information about this, if you're interested, is in some of the attached guidance documents, and we'll go through those more during the resources section, but just to give a brief explanation to those three monitoring types. If you are interested in learning more about routine monitoring, there's a link that I'm pretty sure will end up in the chat, and that can give you more information about routine monitoring. Just to talk quickly about SPATs, because I mentioned them in that timeline and slightly before, but these are used in routine monitoring. So basically there's a tiered monitoring approach that you can see the steps of on the screen here. So first you deploy the SPATs or the, again, solid phase adsorption toxin tracking for about 4 to 7 days to gather preliminary data on cyanobacterial levels and capture cyanotoxin concentrations. And this kind of helps determine when cyanotoxins are increasing in the river system. You can kind of just deploy them in the river and then walk away until retrieval, which is convenient. And then following the spot deployment and removal, you can confirm if the results indicate that cyanotoxins are increasing. As a quick note you can see from the pictures, if you're curious, these equipment are made from bags that are pinched between these round hoops, and inside they have resin beads that absorb the toxins. So the second step then, after deployment and removal of the spats, is to conduct a visual assessment to look for those benthic blooms. So if you notice that the cyanotoxins are increasing, then you would conduct the tier 2 level, which is that visual monitoring. And then the third tier, if a bloom is present, is to collect the benthic mat samples and confirm toxicity. So essentially, the spat analysis is used as a first pass for potential increases, again, in cyanotoxin production of harmful benthic mats in a water body. And the North Coast Regional Boards, again, has found some early results from their studies that suggest that this tiered monitoring approach using the spats will cut down on staff time and costs of collecting and analyzing benthic mat samples. So it's a great idea to kind of, if you can and have the resources to do this routine monitoring, because it offers the opportunity to proactively, as opposed to reactively with event response, monitor streams and figure out where toxin production is happening, as well as to inform future monitoring studies and where to do more targeted monitoring. So if you have questions about that, we can circle back more during the Q&A, but I just wanted to touch briefly on routine monitoring. But again, the remainder of this section will focus more on the event response. So going back to this slide, how we can actually characterize these potentially harmful blooms include, as I mentioned earlier, the percent coverage. So looking at percent cover data or just presence absence. Also by the cyanobacterial taxonomy, so the types and abundance of cyanobacteria genera that are present. You can do this through DNA barcoding or micro or macroscopy. And then lastly, through toxin analysis. So this can be done through spats and or an ELISA test or qPCR. And this is to quantify the cyanotoxin concentrations or toxin-producing genes. And I just wanted to note here that steps 2 and 3, or characterization types 2 and 3, are not actually separate steps. That's why we have the little bracket there and the icon, the same icon shared between them. We're just separating them here for ease of explaining, but they are all part of the same sample, which will again be elaborated more in the field SOP section. So each of these methods was assessed based on how directly or indirectly each method could measure the potential of recreational exposure of benthic HCBs to humans and domestic animals, along with the relative time and economic costs associated with each of these methods, and then the level of training and experience needed, as well as the potential benefits provided by long-term or ongoing collection. So these pictures that you just saw on the last slide and are blown up here are going to be continued throughout the field SOP section, along with those kind of title boxes colored in blue and brown. So the percent coverage or visual assessments will be indicated by this picture, and the title slides, which currently is in gray, but during the field SOP section will be in blue for coverage assessments, and then for the brown for the composite mat sample to analyze toxins and taxonomy. You'll see these pictures and the brown title slides. So just to kind of start that segue and remind you, it's okay if you forget, because we'll have these well explained and detailed throughout the section. But if you notice the color change, that's what it is. So to walk through some of the thresholds now for coverage assessments, starting first with the percent cover. that 15% threshold that I mentioned earlier, so anything less than 15% cover is going to have a green sign posted. Anything more than 15% cover, you'll post a yellow sign. So the percent cover includes within a sampling reach of about 150 feet and can include one or more genera of concern. And so if you're unfamiliar with the signage postings, there is a green sign, which indicates hazards may be present in the water, and then that yellow sign will indicate that a hazard is present. So this visual does not include the interim thresholds for the cyanotoxin concentration, since we're not really focusing on SPAT results for this presentation. But I did just want to note that the previous benthic guidance had no numeric trigger levels, which is not to be confused with planktonic trigger levels, which do exist. And when you are monitoring, oops, let's go back here. So when you're monitoring and you do post a sign, you want to monitor for 2 consecutive weeks. And if you don't observe cyanobacteria increasing, you can depost the sign. And there is more information, more detailed information in the guidance documents. But again, this is just a quick brief overview for the percent cover thresholds. And then for the sample that you would take to analyze toxins and taxonomy, sorry, I mentioned that toxin information a bit early, but here are the thresholds for the toxin. So considering again the percent cover data, but also if you don't have any toxins present, you can post that green sign if it's less than 15% cover. And if it's greater than 15% cover with toxins present, then you definitely would want to post that yellow sign. And then again, you'll depost the signs if there's no toxins present, plus less than 15% cover observed within those 2 consecutive weeks of monitoring. And if you are, for the toxin concentrations, using SPATs, there are some thresholds that you can look out for either an increase in eightfold increase from week to week, or specific unit thresholds that we can talk more about if folks have questions on that. So this is a work in progress, and it's continuing to develop as the science develops. But again, this is just the preliminary updates for those new thresholds. Okay, so now I think we are going to transition into the field SOP section. So I'll turn it over to Elena for this part.
Awesome. Thanks, Hannah. All right, so we're gonna jump right on in. Can go to the next slide. So this SOP is meant to provide a rapid assessment of benthic harmful algal blooms, and it was designed to be easily implemented by monitoring groups like you all, and also specifically for folks who may not have a lot of resources, so you don't need any specialized scientific equipment, and any supplies you do need are inexpensive. So the basics of the protocol involve a visual assessment for coverage and hazards, and collection of a composite mat sample for toxins and taxonomy. And just as Hannah mentioned earlier, this is a work in progress, and we'll be updating it based on new science as it becomes available. So to start off with the equipment and supplies that you'll need, this list is not exhaustive, but you can go into the full SOP that there's a link for, Carly dropped in the chat, and you can find a nice printable checklist with every item that you would need in there. But just to give you an overview, you'll want to bring some paperwork, so a copy of the SOP. You've got a field data sheet you'll be filling out, a chain of custody form, and then if you want, there's these helpful documents we'll go over a little later, including a 2-pager cheat sheet to bring into the field and a genera identification guide. You're going to want to bring these data collection supplies, so some kind of GPS, a measuring tape, clipboard, and pen. And then your algal mat collection materials, so gloves for protection, something to maybe scrape any of it off material like a putty knife, and then forceps for handling the materials. Some cleaning tools, so a drying cloth, a detergent. There's a specific type of detergent that's mentioned in the full SOP. You'll want a soft brush or sponge and a wash basin. And your sample storage and shipping materials, so you have an amber bottle for collection and resealable Ziploc bags to put your chain of custody form in, some ice gel packs for preserving those samples, and then putting all of it into a cooler for when you go to ship it. And you can also bring a underwater viewing tool of some type. So this is a picture of a bathoscope. There's also homemade versions. There's some information on making a DIY underwater viewing tool that might help you in the full SOP. Okay, so once you have all of your equipment and materials, you want to choose your assessment method based on where you're sampling from and which type of water body you're in. So first, you'll start by asking where you're going to sample from. If it's the shoreline, you'll use method C. And if it's in the water, then based on which type of water body, whether it's in a pond, you'll use assessment method B, or in a flowing channel, you'll use assessment method A. And for the rest of this SOP, we'll focus mostly on A, which is in the water in a flowing channel, because that's the most common method that will be used, but we'll cover all three, and they'll be indicated by these green circles with the letters inside them. All right, so once you know which assessment method you're using, you'll want to define your sampling area. This is going to be the maximum of 150 feet reach, paying special attention to areas with high risk of exposure. So you'll want to choose a location that has minimal heavy impact, like tramping of the substrate, but it's also a balance. So you want to target recreational areas where that exposure is going to be expected, but also avoid heavily disturbed areas like boat launches. And then you'll go out and use your measuring tape to mark out that 150-foot reach. And you want to mark where the limits of that reach are using any kind of objects that you can use, like coolers or other things you're bringing along with you. You can also go out and get some stakes, or like pictured here, little flags that have colorful flag tape at the top that you can get for cheap at Home Depot or something. One tip is that if you are interested in sampling an area that's greater than 150 feet, you'll want to do a second assessment elsewhere. So your unit of measurement that you're observing is that 150-foot reach. So then you'll want to prepare for your sample collection. So you'll set up all your sampling equipment and supplies near where your sample site is going to be, so they're within easy reach. Preferably, you'll want to use an amber glass jar, like what's pictured on the right here. Amber because we don't want a lot of light to get into that sample, because the photosynthesis will change the sample. And glass, ideally, because toxins can leach into plastic. So if possible, this amber glass jar would be ideal. If not, it's okay. Then you'll want to complete labels with the following information. First, your station code or site name, which you want to include a water body name and a landmark. That's outlined in green on the right here at the top of the label. And then you'll want the date. And then you'll want to indicate that the sample type is a benthic composite. So if you're using a waterproof pen, you'll want to pre-label containers at each site. But if you don't have a waterproof pen, complete the labels at the sites and then apply them to the container after sampling. and cover that label with clear tape to prevent any kind of loss of text due to smudging or something. Okay, so next you'll do a visual assessment of the sample area. So you'll want to walk along that entire reach that you've staked out and look for algal and cyanobacteria mats in all sorts of places that they can be found. Here's an image, a diagram on the right that shows where you might see them. So they could be on the shore, floating on the water surface, submerged below the water surface. They could be growing on rocks or other vegetation or wood. And so really you're going to want to give it a good look. The growth can be found in slow moving or fast moving water like riffles, growing in spires or bubble towers like the pictures that Hannah was showing earlier. And even those smaller areas like riffles can be hotbeds for cover of toxigenic mass. There's a really nice guide you can access on the wiki with lots of pictures to help you figure out how to distinguish harmful algal and cyanobacteria mats from other type of vegetation. Carly just put something in the chat with a link for that, so I would encourage you to check that out if you're new to this kind of thing. Okay, starting with an in-water coverage assessment in your flowing channel, so assessment method A, you'll begin downstream and walk that 150-foot reach upstream in a zigzag pattern. And it's recommended to have 2 people. If you do, in the diagram on the left-hand side here, it shows that you can split it into 2 sections and divide and conquer. So you're both walking upstream in a zigzag pattern. If there's one person, that's all right too, and you'll just do the zigzag pattern all the way across that reach in the water. Okay, so still in the water, but if you're in a pond, you'll start at opposite ends of the 150-foot area of the pond and wade towards each other if you have 2 people. And then one person, again, will go from one side to the other. And I think we have something on the next slide about that. Yeah, so if it's ponded, you're always going to walk towards the windward side. And if there's no wind, you'll want to walk approximately west to east. And so kind of the same thing applies on the shoreline here as it's showing in the diagram. Always walk upstream or follow these instructions for the ponds. But just a note that field reconnaissance is super important to ensure that you're targeting the area of greatest public health threat. So always use that to guide where you're doing your sampling.
This is a video of one staff member conducting California's methodology for visual assessments of benthic cyanobacteria cover, where the staff member goes in a zigzag pattern from bank to bank, crossing through the mid-channel, no deeper than knee-height water level, and making observations of percent cover. And here's a video of 2 staff members completing the same methodology for visual assessment, except here the staff members meet mid-channel and then turn to continue the zigzag pattern back to their respective stream banks while estimating the percent cover of benthic cyanobacteria in the stream reach that is being monitored.
So if you can, it's an option to identify the taxa present. So these are the 3 most common genera, as Hannah showed in a slide earlier. If you're not able to identify the taxa, don't worry. It's something that you'll learn over time as you get more experienced. But if you can, that's great. And there's a section in the field data sheet where you can put that down that I'll show you later. Okay, so next you're going to record spatial coverage data, and there's a few sections for this. First, you'll determine if visual hazards are present. So these are mats peeling from substrates or at risk of detaching, mats growing in puddles onshore or detached and accumulated onshore, or floating mats in stagnant areas or flowing downstream. And they're just called visual hazards because they pose a more increased risk of exposure to the public, particularly in children and dogs, who are more likely to be interacting with that shoreline.
So here are just some examples of visual hazards. First, we have mats peeling from the substrate, and when you prod it, it detaches. Then we have some floating mats in a stagnant area. And here you can kind of see that the microcoleus has a texture like raw chicken. And when you pick it up and rub it together in your fingers, it comes apart. Now we have some floating mats flowing downstream. These ones have been dislodged by disturbance from someone walking through the water. So you can see this area that has a lot of substrate that's been kicked up, and there's quite a lot of mats there. We want to emphasize that the biggest hazard here is ingestion by children and dogs. Only 1 centimeter squared of this mat material can kill a dog if ingested. And you can see here that stranded mats on rocks are pretty easily accessible from the shoreline.
Then you're going to identify the distribution of the spatial coverage. So for this, it's helpful to divide the area into thirds, or approximately 50-foot portions along that reach, as you can see in the diagram on the right here. So you'll pay attention to the spatial coverage and growth patterns for each of those 3 portions. And then that portion that has the greatest spatial coverage and unique growth patterns will be used to record your final values in the field data sheet. So looking at this figure, you're going to determine whether there's dispersed versus concentrated distributions of benthic cyanobacteria. Here, the cyanobacteria is depicted as light green, brown, and dark green morphotypes in the diagram. And as you can see here, dispersed is where growth is observed more throughout the sampling area with a range of densities, whereas concentrated, you might see patches be connected to each other or more concentrated in a specific area. Next is to identify the size class of the cyanobacterial growth. So here you'll determine what size the largest mat is, whether that's more like a basketball size, doormat size, or a sedan sized. Often there are many smaller patches in a single larger patch. And in this case, you'll check the box associated with the largest size class and record any observations you have about variation in sizes of patches in the notes section. Finally, for spatial coverage data, you'll determine the percentage of cover. So a tip here is, again, to divide that linear length of the sampling reach into thirds and estimate spatial coverage of each portion. And again, pick the greatest coverage category to represent the entire sampling area. And what this does is it biases decisions on percent coverage to a greater value, which is the more conservative value for public health purposes. And on the right here, there's a diagram showing these different categories of what the spatial coverage might look
Here's
like.
an example of
if
what
it's under
15%
15%
filamentous algae
or
coverage
15
looks
to
like.
50%,
Here's an
or
example of
greater than
100%
50%,
coverage.
which are the
So
3
you're tracing
categories
around the
that
left
you'll
side,
choose from
now
to mark
pointing
down
towards the
in the
middle of
field
the
data
patch.
sheet, which I'll show later.
There's a
And
small
the field data
dislodged
sheet
patch
itself
over in
has
this
this
area,
diagram
but
on
the
it to
rest
help you
is
out.
an example of 100% coverage. And then, of course, we have a patch over here that's bare next to it.
All right, moving on to actually collecting the samples. The first thing you're going to do is collect an ambient water sample in your amber glass jar. So you'll go ahead and just dip the jar in until it's about a quarter full of that water. And that's really just to act as a preservative for the mat sample. So once you have that, you'll collect your composite mat sample. So unlike planktonic blooms, water samples are not great at detecting toxins. You have to get an actual mat sample. But before we move on, I want to provide you with some definitions. So morphotypes are cyanobacteria with distinct physical characteristics like color, texture, or growth form. And when you go to collect your composite, you want to aim for a composite that consists of a diversity of specimens. So you want to try to maximize the different types of morphotypes that you're collecting when you're out there. And each piece that you collect, you'll want to be about 3 centimeters by 3 centimeters in size. Okay, the next definition is a hotspot. This is an area of higher benthic growth of potential cyanobacteria. This is representative again of the worst case scenario in terms of exposure. So you'll want to note where that cyanobacteria growth is most dense and or covers the most spatial area. And those are the hot spots that you'll want to pay attention to for sample collection. Okay, so going back to your assessment method, if you are in water, at any type of water body, you'll collect from 2 hot spots in the water and 2 hot spots near the shoreline, as is pictured in the diagram on the right here. You'll aim for 3 pieces of mat material at each location whenever you're sampling, and 3 pieces times those 4 hotspot locations will be a total of 12 pieces that you're looking to collect. If you're sampling from the shoreline, so assessment method C, you'll want to collect from 2 to 4 hotspots near the shoreline. And if you end up finding fewer than 4 hotspots, you'll want to collect additional pieces at each spot so that you end up with a total of 12 pieces for your composite mat sample. And this shoreline sampling can include detached mats.
Example of preparing your sample container with ambient water and then collecting a pinch of benthos and adding it to the bottle immediately to prevent drying.
All right, once you've got your sample, you're going to want to preserve that and ship it off. So label and place your samples on ice in a cooler right after collection. Fill out that field data sheet that I'll show you in a second in its entirety, noting any details or specific observations that you made. Fill out that chain of custody form in its entirety, ideally making an electronic copy. You'll also want to contact the lab prior to shipping your samples and coordinate shipping timeframes, shipping conditions, and that accompanying paperwork that you're sending along. And also check with the mail carrier to determine shipping deadlines for overnight shipping to the lab. So for preserving and shipping those samples, there are a few more tips here. Hold time for lab receival is 5 days. You're going to want to store samples in a dark cooler or refrigerator, ideally 2 to 8 degrees centigrade. Don't freeze your samples. Include your completed chain of custody form inside a Ziploc bag to avoid damage. Ship samples overnight. Email the lab with your chain of custody form and an ETA for your sample, and don't ship on a Friday or Saturday. And this and more are all listed in the detailed SOP. So just to review what we went over, but grounding us in the actual field data sheet that you're going to be filling out, we had our coverage assessment, which you'll indicate here, which method you were using, shoreline or in water or other. And then if you're able to identify the genera and take photos, so those 3 main genera are listed here and you can check off what you see. your mat location. So whether that's near the shore, in a pool or run, in spires or bubble towers, lots of options here, and you can make sure that you're looking in all those locations as you're filling out the field data sheet and checking off where you're finding everything. We had our visual hazards, so you're going to check off if any of those apply. Here's where you'll identify the mat distribution, whether it's dispersed or concentrated. Your mat size, whether it's more basketball, doormat, or sedan sized. Your percent cover using this handy diagram that's on the right here in the field data sheet. And finally, information associated with your cyanobacteria mat composite collection. So whether or not you're collecting them, there's a section here to indicate if spats are being deployed, if you know about this, how the sample was collected, whether that's from the shore or both from the shore and the water, and then how samples will be analyzed in the lab, including those toxins and the cyanobacteria ID taxonomy. Okay, so that's the basics of the field data sheet. We also have some other helpful field reference sheets that we will be sending to you all along with this presentation afterwards. The first is a 2-pager cheat sheet that kind of is meant for folks who have already gone through the SOP in the field at least once before and just need something to remind them of the basic steps. That visual genera guide that we have in the chat. And these are just really useful reference sheets for you to have, especially if you're newer at this kind of thing. Okay, so that wraps up the field SOP portion of our presentation. If folks want any clarifications or have questions, we have some time for Q&A at the end of the session. But right now I'll hand it back over to Hannah to talk to you about interpreting data to inform signage.
Awesome. Thanks, Elena. So yeah, as we kind of start to conclude in this last section of today's presentation, I want to note that, again, going back to some of those studies from the North Coast region and some of the public and partner feedback that was received under previous thresholds from previous guidances, there were indications of sign fatigue. So the public was kind of feeling distrustful from overposting, as well as noting some economic impacts to local communities and businesses. So that was something to take into consideration when implementing these new thresholds and ideally promoting more trust around the signage postings. So if you're familiar with the previous signs, they used to be like the 2 pictures that you see here on the right. So there were 2 signs available, a general awareness green check for algae sign, and then a trigger level sign that was posted when toxic algae were present in the waters. So you can see here that there are some helpful pictures and general information on these signs. But going back actually quickly, I just want to note here that for the trigger level signs, there were still no numeric trigger levels for posting. So they were posting signs if there was any cyanobacteria present and or any cyanotoxins detected, whether that was through the spats or mat samples. So these new thresholds were based on, again, those early studies with spat results as indicators, as well as the percent cover data for benthic mats. There's still no threshold for cyanotoxins in mats, so that's something I'll touch on at the end. But the sign objectives have always been to provide the public with information on how to identify toxic mats, and also to advise the public on preventative practices to reduce the risk of exposure. So those continue to be the objectives, even through these new updated signs. But the new triggers, as I mentioned in the updated guidance, are centered around the percent cover. So greater than or less than that 15%, you'll see here for the columns. And this percent cover assumes that cyanobacteria are present, so anything greater than 0%. And it also considers the fact that staff can visually identify the cyanobacteria in the field. So that's important to note there. And then for the rows, you'll see cyanotoxin data. So starting first at the top here, no benthic mat cyanotoxin data is available. So you didn't collect, you don't have data available, compared to the second row here, which is you collected data and then found that there were no cyanotoxins detected. So that's a slight difference there. And then you'll see cyanotoxins data were collected and detected. And then this last box here I included, despite not focusing a ton on spats in today's presentation, in the extended full version of the document, talking about these signage triggers, you can see less common scenarios. And so that can include combinations of low spat concentrations, high spat concentrations, and different percent covers. So I'm just going to focus on the more common scenarios today, which are these 3 rows and 2 columns that I'm about to walk through. So starting first, if you have anything less than 15% cover and no cyanotoxin data available, you can post that green general awareness check for algae sign. But if you have anything above 15% cover, you're going to want to post that yellow toxic algae alert. For collecting cyanotoxin data and then not having any cyanotoxins detected, you can choose whether or not you post a sign or not. So you can do no sign or that green general awareness sign for anything less than 15% cover. But again, even if you don't have any cyanotoxins detected, if you have something higher than 15% cover, you post that yellow toxic algae alert sign. And then if you have anything less than 15% cover and there are cyanotoxins detected, you have a choice of posting either a green or a yellow sign. I'll touch upon what determines that decision in a moment, but just to reiterate that again, if there's anything more than 15% cover, especially if there are cyanotoxins detected, you post that yellow sign. So going back briefly to anything less than 15%, if you choose the green sign, follow-up or routine monitoring is required. If you have no monitoring planned, or if there are particularly high cyanotoxins detected, then you'd post this yellow sign. So slightly dependent on your situation, determining what sign you post there. But while under an advisory, the water should be observed approximately bi-weekly by the responding organization. So if an observation suggests that the bloom or the algal mats are significantly increasing or decreasing, then the responding organization should conduct follow-up monitoring for cyanotoxins and or those cyanobacteria mats. So these are some of the proposed signage updates. As you can see, the pretty obvious update is that they're now available for dual language. So we have both English and Spanish available on the signs, sticking again with the green and yellow toxic algae alert or just check for algae signs. A lot of the information primarily has stayed the same. However, there are updated pictures, so some clearer, bit more informative pictures here, as well as a QR code for folks to scan and get more information about benthic algal mats, or what to do in terms of how to respond. And then also there's a slot where you can put the date that the sign was posted. So this is hopefully to promote and encourage a bit more trust behind the signs if people know exactly how long that sign has been posted and out for. So potential considerations even for future renovations or renditions of this sign is to possibly incorporate numeric trigger levels for that cyanotoxin concentrations and have those thresholds, and also to incorporate trigger levels for the percent cover on these signs. So to begin kind of concluding before we get into the resources, I just want to highlight some of the main takeaways. Number one being that the mobile nature of these mats, so their ability to detach and collect downstream, does present management challenges, as well as the ability for there to be multiple genera of cyanobacteria within a single mat. So all those things are important to consider in terms of how they create messaging challenges as well as management challenges. And then again, percent cover data, which we've really been emphasizing today, is rapid, it's low cost, and it does relate well to potential harmful cyanobacterial exposure. So while it still does not tell you about toxin concentrations, by collecting complementary data with SPATs concentrations as well as the percent cover data, monitoring becomes more protective and comprehensive, and also therefore provides more information for posting decisions. It's also important to note that percent cover data is really important for making informed decisions to issue immediate postings. So if you were to collect cyanotoxin data, that can take weeks to be processed. And so having this percent cover data is still really important to be able to make those signage postings happen quickly. And then again, anything above that 15% cover level will trigger a sign to be posted. And then I also wanted to note that 15% cover is a little bit more conservative than previous thresholds. Some areas like New Zealand have used anywhere between 20 to 15%. But in all of but one of the previous studies that we referred to, 15% cover has aligned well with the mat samples and SPAT results. So those are results from, again, those North Coast studies. And then cyanobacterial ID is recommended, as Elena mentioned. It'd be great if you can report what type of genera are present, but it's not directly related to the signage posting. So it's okay if you can't with the available resources that you have, but it is also just another plug for doing some more routine monitoring, because if you go out more regularly, you'll have a better trained eye to ID these cyanobacterial types in the field. Additionally, having additional indicators and integrating passive samples allows for better understanding of the stream conditions, and it allows for this repeatable methodology. So this in turn helps for evaluating temporal and spatial distributions, along with evaluating the status and trends that are occurring in your monitored streams. So here is a brief resources section. I want to start first with the contact information. So I'm pretty sure this email will also be thrown in the chat for you to copy and paste, but this is the main email for all cyanobacterial benthic harmful algal mats information for you to report or reach out to with questions. So this is a really important email to have. And then here is a link or a page with several links to various resources that have a variety of different information for you to reference. And if you have questions or want to look back at information after today's presentation, a lot of that is covered throughout these various links. So those are also now included in the chat. And before we open it up to questions, I did just want to put this survey, which is a Google form, in the chat as well. So the link is there. That's what you see for the little gray box that says training for CCHAB Benthic toxic algal mats guidance. Similar to the Zoom poll, if you were here at the beginning of the training, this is just 5 brief questions to help us get a better understanding of how we did communicating this information, and also to see what information still might be lacking or confusing for you. So this is kind of a great way for us to learn and iterate these presentations for future trainings. So if you can just, again, most of them are multiple choice, talking about how comfortable you feel now taking the training. If you feel like you are better or worse off than just reading the SOP after listening to all of this. And then feel free to also answer what material, if any, is still confusing to you. And the F answer for number 3 is other. If you do this right now before questions, you can put that in the short answer for any follow-up you'd like from us if you want to elaborate more. So yeah, take a moment to either do that now, since we have quite a bit of time for questions, or copy and paste the link and you can fill it out after this training. But we'd really appreciate your feedback on this. So with that, we'll leave this open for questions if people have any. Again, I think Carly and Marissa are on the call and can chime in to help answer any questions, but feel free to raise your hand or unmute or send stuff in the chat.
Yeah, hey folks, this is Marissa Van Dyke, on the water boards, colleagues of Elena and everyone that's been presenting right now. So we're ready to take questions if you have them.
Yeah, go ahead, Lisa.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. This was really helpful. I'm wondering if there are any apps like iNaturalist that are good at identifying the genus, the genera.
Oh, good question. Yeah, iNaturalist is really great. You know, we're not aware of any other apps that can help identify benthic or this, toxic algal mat cyanobacteria. And with iNaturalist, I don't know if you've looked at it recently. Have they expanded their capacity to be able to help verify identifications beyond planktonic blooms if you look under the microscope, or? Perhaps not. So I think the short answer is that we're not aware of any other apps, but we will look into iNaturalist to see if they've expanded their capacity, because historically they have been helpful in identifying planktonic or those free-floating cyanobacteria blooms.
Okay, but not so much the benthic ones.
We haven't seen it, but
Okay.
we are a little out of date on our knowledge of what the capacity is for iNaturalist.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for asking. And we collaborated, with through CCHAB Network and with many different states on benthics. And with that, in developing that short fact sheet on like quick key, identifying them in the field, we didn't hear from anyone else that there were apps available.
I think there was a question in the chat as well from Joy saying, I'm not clear if we can trigger our own posting for signage or if we wait for Swamp to approve.
Joy, I just caught up to that. Thank you. Go ahead, Carly.
Oh, that's a great question. So this is a voluntary program, so there is no regulatory authority. So we focusing based on the decision tree I put in the chat. But if you ever have any questions of what the most appropriate signage is, please reach out to us. We're on clarity on that as well. As well as we do have some signs that we can distribute out to folks.
And just to expand on that, we do appreciate that, any entity participating in this voluntary process, inform health protection from benthic CABs, that you notify the water boards through, the HAB reporting form or through our email that you have done posting, so that we can share that on our statewide map that's been up for about 7 years and come to be a statewide resource. And so we can work with you on helping get that message out, help with outreach that way, if we all communicate.
Hey, this is Carl Anderson. I had a question. And if I missed this, I apologize. The very first slide you showed at the very beginning of the presentation that had the, I can't remember what you called it, but it looked like algae. It almost looked like paint splattered on the surface, like somebody threw kind of a paint brush and splattered it on the surface. It was the very first slide that you showed. Is that stuff to be, I didn't catch, is that algae that's to be concerned about or not as far as toxins go?
I'll help answer that one. Can we show just for the audience that first slide again? I don't know if
Yes,
that works for you.
Going back to the first one, but there's so many animations, so one moment while I bring
Sorry about that.
But
no,
I can start helping frame that. So when you see like that surface sheen of like it looks like paint splattered on there, or like maybe like a little bit of spill of some paint, that's normally associated with the planktonic blooms that we see in California and many other places in the world. And so the planktonic blooms are that free floating cyanobacteria bloom, and it's quite classic. Yeah, I see that.
Yeah, that's we get that a lot. So that's why I was in.
Whereabouts are you? Which county? Or
I'm in Los Angeles County. I'm at Frank G. Bonelli Park or Puddingstone Lake, but that usually we'll have a few cold days. There'll be a sunny day, and that's the type of stuff that we get. One year it was like a Caribbean blue color, but most of the time it's that color. And so I was just wondering, is that something to be concerned about?
Yeah, so this is, again, potential planktonic bloom of cyanobacteria, and this is something to be concerned about. The original CCHAB Network guidance that's been up on the platform since 2016 can help you address that and with like a quick guide. But if you want to email us at that cyanohab.reports@waterboard's email, Carly or I can give you some more information. We're more than happy to provide that background. And I just wanted to highlight with this photo, like it looks like it's a little bit more yellowish in color. And, cyanobacteria can range in color from that yellowish, brownish, blue, green, and same with the benthic cyanobacteria. So please check out our resources to help you differentiate it visually, and then like what steps you can take to identify it, to confirm it by lab-based analysis.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for asking. I'm looking at the chat history. I think we addressed all the written questions and comments.
Yeah,
Is there any other feedback?
Stop sharing. Yeah, if there are any last minute questions, feel free again to either post them in the chat or come off mute or raise your hand.